Welcome students, I'm Dr. Sonu Shiva, Associate Professor, Department of English, Government Dungar College, Bikaner. This session is for BA second year English Literature paper first. And in your first paper you have two poems by Alfred Lord Tennyson. One is Lotus Eaters and the other one is Tears Idle Tears. In this session we'll be dealing with the introduction of this poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, who he was, his works, his style of writing, etc. If you look at Tennyson's early life, he was born on 6th August 1809 in Somersby, Lincolnshire, England, in a middle-class family. He was tutored in classical and modern languages. The young Alfred demonstrated an early flair for poetry, composing full-length verse drama at the age of 14. So at a very tender age, he composed a full-length verse drama. His appearance, you can see in this picture also, is a large and bearded man. He regularly wore a cloak and a broad-brimmed hat. And he read his poetry with a booming voice, often compared to that of Dylan Thomas. And Dylan Thomas was a Welsh writer, often known for his comic exuberance and pathos. Education and friendship. These two are very important in any writer's life. These are the places: King Edward VI Grammar School, where he was a student, and then he entered Trinity College, and this he escaped home in 1827, and then he entered Trinity College to attend his classes. In that same year, he and his brother Charles, they published Poems by Two Brothers. This is the name of the collection of his books, of his poems. And though the poems in the book were mostly juvenile, they attracted the attention of Apostles, an undergraduate literary club held by Arthur Hallam. So this was the time when his friendship with Arthur Hallam started, because Arthur Hallam was leading this literary club called Apostles. And this club, Apostles, it provided Tennyson, he was tremendously shy, with much needed friendship and confidence as a poet. These two things were in him. And when he became closest friend of Arthur Hallam, he was able to overcome that. He joined this secret society called Cambridge Apostles in Cambridge. And this Arthur Hallam and Tennyson, they toured Europe together in 1830 and again in 1832. But soon, Hallam's sudden death in 1833, it affected Tennyson a lot as a young poet, and he has written a long elegy in memoriam, and many of Tennyson's other poems are tributes to Hallam. So there are a lot of poems that he has written as a tribute to his closest friend, Arthur Hallam. When we look at the works of Tennyson, he published poems that were chiefly lyrical, and in 1832 he published a second volume entitled Simply Poems. Some reviewers condemned these books as affected and obscure, and Tennyson was greatly affected by this review. So he did not publish another book for let's say 9 years. In 1850, with the publication of In Memoriam, so this was the turning point, Tennyson became one of the Britain's most popular poets. So in 1850, when this collection was published, he became one of the most popular poets. He was selected poet laureate in succession to Wordsworth. So before Tennyson, Wordsworth was poet laureate, and after Wordsworth's death, he was selected as poet laureate. At the age of 41, Tennyson had established himself as the most popular poet of the Victorian era. The money from his poetry, he was getting a lot at times exceeding £10,000 per year. And Tennyson also published first 4 Idylls of the King, the group of 12 blank verse narrative poems tracing the story of legendary King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So this collection, the Idylls of the King, this collection he dedicated it to Prince Albert, who enjoyed much popularity among the royal family. The royal family became very impressed with this work of Tennyson, who saw Arthur's legendary lengthy reign as a representation of Queen Victoria's 64 years rule. In 1884, the royals granted Tennyson a baronetcy. He was now known as Alfred Lord Tennyson. So because he got this royal post, he was then started to be known as Alfred Lord Tennyson. If we look at the style of Tennyson, he used a wide range of subject matter. His poetry, his subject matter, his topics, they range from medieval legends to classical myths, from domestic situations to observations of nature. You can also see the influence of John Keats and other romantic poets that published before and during his childhood. So there is a reflection of romantic poets in his works, because in poems of Tennyson also you see that richness of imagery and descriptive writing as romanticists. He also handled rhythm masterfully. He reflects the Victorian periods of his maturity in his feeling for order and tendency towards moralizing. So he's a true representative of Victorian period. He also reflects concern common among Victorian writers in being troubled by the conflict between religious faith and expanding scientific knowledge. So even till his reign, till his period as a writer, that Darwin's Origin of Species was still not out, but still, as other Victorian writers, he did have that conflict between religious faith and scientific knowledge, which was expanding. The common thread of grief, melancholy, and loss connects much of his poetry, especially when you read his poem Tears, Idle Tears. You find that there is a thread of grief and there is sadness and loss, and including in the poems like Mariana, The Lotus Eaters, Tears, Idle Tears, In Memoriam, possibly reflecting Tennyson's own lifelong struggle with debilitating depression. Somewhere his poems, maybe they reflect his own life, Tennyson's life. You have in your course Tears, Idle Tears and The Lotus Eaters. Influences. As a poet, T.S. Eliot feels about him as the saddest of all English poets. There's so much of sadness, and when we are going to do this Tears, Idle Tears, after this introduction in my other session, you're going to feel that yes, there's a lot of sadness, a lot of melancholic note is there in his poem. So T.S. Eliot also described Tennyson as the saddest of English poets, whose technical mastery of verse and language provided a surface to his poetry's depths, to the abyss of sorrow. So his poetry, they often surface the sorrow, the melancholic aspect which is there in his own life, and that's reflected in his poems. Then Tennyson's early poetry with its medievalism and powerful visual imagery was a major influence on the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848. Tennyson poetry also influenced the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848, where you see that the pre-Raphaelite like Dante, Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt, they made a list of immortal artist heroes whom they admired, especially from literature, notably including Keats and Tennyson, whose works would form subjects for pre-Raphaelite paintings. So Tennyson also inspired these pre-Raphaelite paintings from his works. If you look at the later years of this poet, he dedicated most of the last 15 years of his life to writing of series of full-length dramas in blank verse. But the later years, he was not at all successful in exciting any sort of a particular interest. In 1892, at the age of 83, he died of heart failure and was buried among his illustrious literary predecessors at Westminster Abbey. So his grave is there in Westminster Abbey. Although Tennyson was most popular poet in England in his own day, he was often the target of mockery by his immediate successors, the Edwardians and the Georgians of the early 20th century. So many of the writers of the early 20th century, they have mocked him and targeted him because of his works. Today, however, many critics consider Tennyson to be the greatest poet of Victorian age, and he stands as one of the major innovators of lyric and metrical form in all English poetry. So, despite of so many mockery on his work and being targeted, still he is considered as the greatest poet of Victorian age, and he is the innovator of lyric and metrical form of English poetry. Thank you.